He stands a step behind the president, a half shadow at the edge of the frame. Yet every camera knows exactly where to find him. The name is simple: J.D. Vance. The title is not Vice President of the United States. On the surface, he looks like the American dream rendered in navy wool and flag pins. Born in a broken Rust Belt town, Marine Corps veteran, Yale law, the kid who clawed his way out of chaos and turned his life into a bestseller called Hillbilly Elegy. Millions read the book. Hollywood turned it into a film. For a moment, he was the media's favorite interpreter of angry, forgotten America. That's the version most people know. The memoir, the speeches about broken families and lost factories. The loyal running mate who now sits in the heart-bed-away chair, nodding behind the president during premium time addresses, but that story is only half of it. Long before he was sworn in on the steps of the Capitol, long before crowds chanted his name at rallies, J.D. Vance was something else. A project. A bet. A carefully placed chip on the future of American power. In conference rooms, far from Ohio. Venture capital titans and political strategists had already circled his name. They saw more than a mem. They saw a bridge, someone who could speak fluent Rust Belt and fluent billionaire at the same time, a man who could translate Silicon Valley money into votes in the places that decide elections. By the time voters in Ohio saw his face on a ballot, he had already helped launch a venture fund. He had already co-founded a quiet donor network designed to reshape the conservative movement from the inside. His rise was not spontaneous combustion. It was ignition. That doesn't mean every step was scripted. Politics is messier than that. But if you trace the lines of money, media, and mobilization, the pattern is hard to ignore. On one side, a vice president with a best-selling autobiography and a populist message. On the other, a lattice of donors, operatives, and media platforms that lifted him faster than most senators' rise in a lifetime. And then, just off to the side of that lattice, another figure appears. A widow who steps into her husband's shoes at the head of one of the most aggressive youth organizations in American politics. Erika Kirk, a different story, a different grief, but tied to the same orbit of influence. Together, they form a new kind of power couple. Not the glossy, Camelot fairy tale of the 20th century, but something colder, more strategic. One seated at the apex of government, the other commanding an army of young activists and culture. Warriors. Most Americans will never read the donor lists that backed J. Vance. They won't sit in the rooms where his allies trade policy papers and talking points. They'll only see the clips, the headlines, the viral moments. But behind those images is a question that will define the next decade of American politics. Who built J.D. Vance? And what do they expect in return? Asterisk, he did not start life in a think tank or a boardroom. J.D. Vance was born James Donald Bowman in 1984. In Middletown, Ohio, a small industrial city wedged between Dayton and Cincinnati. The town once lived off a steel mill and mid-century optimism. By the time he was old enough to notice, both were rusting. His parents split when he was a toddler. His mother cycled through partners and addictions. His biological father faded into the background. Vance and his sister were raised mostly by their grandparents, Mamo and Papa Tough. Volatile figures from eastern Kentucky who brought the culture of Appalachia with them, guns over the fireplace, Bible verses on the wall, a constant simmer of anger at anyone called an elite. For millions of Americans, this is just life. For J.D. Vance, it would become raw material. In Middletown, nothing about him looked like a future vice president, but almost everything about him looked like a future story. School was uneven. He drifted, fought, watched adults implode. The person who enforced order was his grandmother, a woman who threatened to kill a man if he ever hit her grandson again, and meant it. At 17, he was smart enough to see two paths. One led to the same dead ends he'd grown up around. The other led out. He chose the Marine Corps. In 2003, the same year he graduated high school. Vance enlisted in the Marines and trained as a combat correspondent, a military journalist embedded with the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing. 2 years later, he was in Iraq, not as a door kicker, but as the man with a notebook and a camera, recording stories the Pentagon wanted Americans to see. On paper, it was a safe role. In reality, he watched the distance between official speeches and ground-level reality stretch wider and wider. Later profiles describe a young Marine losing faith in the idea that America could simply export democracy at gunpoint. Those years in uniform gave him something the Future Network would prize: a loyalty credential and a grievance. When he left the Marines in 2007, he did what thousands of veterans do: used the GI Bill to go to college. At Ohio State University, he moved with startling speed, graduating summa cum laude in political science and philosophy in just 2 years. Then, aiming even higher, Yale Law School. There, the culture shock was total. One semester he's stocking shelves at a local store. A few years later, he's in seminar rooms with the children of senators and CEOs, learning the language of the people his grandparents cursed at the television. At Yale, a few encounters changed his trajectory. One was with Professor Amy Chua, who told him flatly that his background was not just tragic, it was valuable. She urged him to write it down, to turn the chaos of his upbringing into a narrative people like her students could finally understand. Another encounter came when a tech billionaire named Peter Thiel gave a talk on campus. Vance approached him afterwards, struck up a relationship, and quietly stepped into a world where ideology and investment blur. In Middletown, his life had made him an outsider. At Yale, the same life made him interesting. Between classes, he wrote under a different name, J.D. Hamill, posting essays on conservative websites about culture, politics, and the meaning of home. He changed his surname to Vance in 2013, honoring the grandparents who had effectively raised him. That same year, he graduated from Yale Law with a new identity, a new network, and the first pages of a book that would make him famous. The memoir would be called Hillbilly Elegy. On the surface, it was one man's story of escape from poverty and addiction. But to publishers, pundits, and eventually to donors, it was something else. A field report from the heart of white working class, America, at the very moment that class was swinging behind Donald Trump. What Vance didn't yet know was that his book would do more than change his life. It would give the people who would later back him a powerful illusion that by investing in J.D. Vance, they were investing in the soul of the heartland itself. And as soon as Hillbilly Elegy hit the bestseller lists, the next phase of that investment could begin. As soon as the book took off, the invitations followed. J.D. Vance went from relative anonymity to green rooms and studio lights in a matter of months. Cable news wanted him to explain this strange, angry force transforming American politics. Editors at coastal newspapers wanted him to decode a country they realized they no longer understood. He sat on sets in New York and Washington, talking about broken towns, opioid deaths, and why people who felt humiliated by the system were drawn to Donald Trump. At first, he wasn't selling admiration, he was selling diagnosis. Vance described Trump as a kind of symptom, a lightning rod for resentment rather than a solution. In interviews and essays, he sounded like a conservative still on the outside of the MAGA storm, uneasy with its chaos but fascinated by the energy behind it. That posture made him even more valuable to a certain audience, people in boardrooms and foundations who were frightened by Trump but desperate to understand the voters who had handed him the keys. He became, for a brief moment, a bridge between two worlds that usually pretend not to see each other. Publishers saw a rare thing, a conservative who could speak fluent elite and fluent working class in the same paragraph. Think tank panels and Aspen-style conferences followed. Vance talked about family breakdown, dignity in work, the spiritual emptiness of consumer culture. He said the American dream was still real, but fragile, and he made it sound like a moral warning rather than a campaign slogan. The more he explained his people to the country's decisions, the more those decision-makers began to look at him differently, not just as a witness, but as a potential actor. He moved into venture capital, joining a firm linked to one of the most controversial and influential figures in Silicon Valley. It was a world of pitch decks and seed rounds, but just under the surface, the conversations were about more than software. They were about where the country was headed, what institutions still had legitimacy, and how much of the old liberal consensus could or should survive. Vance listened, learned, and adjusted. The transformation was subtle at first. Publicly, he still sounded like the man from Hillbilly Elegy, worried about the collapse of community and the dignity of work. Privately, his circle shifted. The people most interested in him were no longer journalists mining a story. They were investors and ideologues looking for a vehicle. To them, Vance represented a rare combination. He had the scars of the Rust Belt, but the polish of Yale. He understood the grievances of the base and the anxieties of the donors. He could talk about God and fentanyl in one breath, and industrial policy and semiconductors in the next. In a political market flooded with loud performers and shallow resumes, he looked like a long-term asset, so they started to build around him. He helped launch a fund with money from some of the richest men in tech, a vehicle aimed at companies based away from the coasts, in places that looked more like his hometown than like Palo Alto. Officially, it was about investing in overlooked America. Unofficially, it signaled something else. That capital was beginning to flow, not just to factories and startups, but to a new narrative about what the right should become. The man who had once criticized Trump now began to sharpen his attacks in a different direction. The problem, he argued, wasn't simply one politician. It was an entire ruling class, concentrated in universities, tech companies, and bureaucracies, that had broken faith with ordinary citizens. He started talking less like an analyst and more like a prosecutor. That shift did not go unnoticed. Right-wing media outlets that had once treated him warily started giving him friendlier airtime. Podcast hosts and nationalist thinkers praised his toughness on trade, his skepticism of foreign wars, his insistence that the state should sometimes use its power to protect families, not just markets. He attacked the same elites who had once invited him to their conferences, and every punch landed harder because he had seen those rooms from the inside. To his critics, this looked like opportunism, a quiet about-face designed to ride a wave he had once questioned. To his supporters, it looked like a conversion story, a man who had stared into the heart of the establishment and decided it needed to be cut down to size. Either way, the effect was the same. The the bridge that had once allowed liberal audiences to understand Trump country now ran in one direction only. Behind the scenes, the network around him thickened. Donor circles overlapped with media strategists and policy entrepreneurs. Plans were drawn up, not just for businesses and advocacy groups, but for campaigns. In those conversations, Vance's name stopped being the punchline to who wrote that big Rust Belt book and started appearing in lists of who should run where. And when it had become something that did not exist when he was growing up in Middletown, a fully integrated political asset, spanning money, narrative, and constituency. From the outside, none of this was obvious yet. To the average viewer catching a clip online, J.D. Vance was still the Hillbilly Elegy guy, a Rust Belt author with sharp opinions and an increasingly hard edge. But to the people sitting around quiet tables and encrypted chats, another identity was taking shape. They were no longer just asking him to explain America, they were asking whether he could help run it. When the moment finally opened, it looked almost ordinary. In January 2021, Ohio's Republican Senator Rob Portman announced he wouldn't run again. One decision in Washington blew a hole in the political map back home. An open seat in a red-leaning state doesn't appear often. For every ambitious Republican in Ohio, it was like smelling blood in the water. For the people around J.D. Vance, it looked like something else. For years he'd been circling politics without fully entering it. Best-selling author, Marine veteran, venture capitalist, frequent guest on television, useful, visible, but not yet committed. An open Senate seat changed the question from should he run someday to what happens if we do it now. Conversations that had been abstract turned specific. Pollsters ran numbers, donors ran scenarios, operatives weighed name recognition against liabilities, and Vance had plenty of both. On the plus side, a compelling story, strong media presence, a network of wealthy backers ready to deploy real money. On the minus side, video after video of him criticizing Donald Trump back when he was still the outsider, explaining Trump voters to nervous elites. Normally that kind of baggage kills a candidacy before it starts. This time, it didn't single quotes because in the background, something unusual was already in motion. A super PAC seated with an eye-watering sum of money, committed to backing a run if Vance stepped onto the field. For a first-time candidate, it was closer to a guarantee than a gamble. Very few people get told, in effect, if you jump, the parachute is already packed. He hesitated in public. In interviews, Vance talked about family, business obligations, the weight of the choice, but the gravity was clear. There are only so many chances to move from commentator to player, from witness to senator. An open Senate seat in your home state, with a war chest forming around your name, is one of them. When he finally announced his candidacy in 2021, he did it as something no opponent in that race could match. A man whose story had already been tested on a national stage, and whose campaign would be heavily armed from day one. The backlash started immediately. Clips of his past comments about Trump flooded onto social media and into local news. In some of them, he called Trump cultural heroin for the people he grew up with. In others, he sounded like a man warning elites to take Trump seriously precisely because he saw him as dangerous. His opponents painted him as a fraud who had read the polls and flipped his loyalties to suit the moment. From the outside, it looked like a fatal contradiction. From inside the network, it was a messaging problem. The super PAC moved first, pouring money into ads that reintroduced him to Ohio voters on their terms. The kid from Middletown, the Marine, the grandson who escaped chaos and came back to fight for his state. His critics focused on old son. His allies focused on images of factories, fentanyl, and family breakdown. The biography that had sold books was now being weaponized to win votes. On the trail, Vance adjusted his tone. The careful analyst from the Hillbilly Elegy tour gave way to a harder-edged candidate. He attacked big tech, Wall Street, and the Republican establishment. He framed the race not as a choice between conservatives and liberals, but between a corrupt ruling class and the people they'd hollowed out. He spoke like someone who had decided that Trump was not the problem but the blunt instrument of something deeper, and that his job was to sharpen that instrument. As the primary dragged on, the advantages of being a project became obvious. The outside money funded data operations, field staff, and relentless advertising. It gave him room to make mistakes and recover, something insurgent candidates rarely get. It also sent a signal to every professional in Republican politics. This is a campaign worth attaching your name to if you believe the future of the party lies with a more aggressive, nationalist right. The final piece fell into place when the former president himself weighed in. In a field full of candidates presenting themselves as loyal Trumpists, the man at the center of the movement eventually gave his endorsement to the one who had once doubted him. For many primary voters, that settled the question. Whatever Vance had said in the past, Trump's blessing rewrote the story in the present. If the man himself could forgive, who were they to hold a grudge? The result surprised the people who had written him off. Vance won the Republican primary, then went on to defeat his Democratic opponent in the general election. In less than 2 years, he traveled from maybe someday candidate to United States Senator. The boy from a collapsing steel town now had an office in the Capitol and a vote on war, judges, and the fate of domestic policy. On paper, it could be told like any other campaign: a man runs, makes his case, wins. But if you zoom out, the pattern is harder to ignore. A network with money, media access, and a clear ideological project picked a vehicle, loaded it with resources, and pushed it through a narrow opening in Ohio's political landscape. The experiment had delivered its proof of concept. They hadn't just helped elect a senator, they had successfully moved their asset onto the national board. From the moment he took the oath as a senator, people inside the network started talking about him in a new way. Before, he had been an experiment. Could their mix of money, media, and message manufacture a candidate from scratch and push him through a contested primary? Now, with a Senate seat secured, the question shifted. Not can he win, but how far can he go? In Washington, freshman senators are supposed to disappear for a while, learn the rules, keep their heads down, wait in line. Vance did the opposite. He used the chamber as a stage and the committee room as a microphone. His speeches were clipped, uploaded, and pushed through the same media ecosystem that had helped elect him. Every line about the ruling class, the border, foreign wars, or childless elites was designed to do double duty: speak to voters back home and signal to the movement that he understood its language. He was not trying to become another anonymous legislator. He was auditioning for something larger. The issues he chose were not random. He leaned into themes that stitched together the different wings of his support. To the nationalist right, he talked about trade, industrial decline, and national power. To religious conservatives, he talked about family collapse and birth rates. To the populist base, he went after corporations, universities, and agencies he framed as contemptuous of ordinary people. The through line was simple: there is an us and a them, and he knew exactly which side he claimed to be on every time he stepped in front of a camera. The clips moved quickly through friendly podcasts, cable shows, and online channels. Hosts framed him as something rare in modern politics: someone young, aggressive, and ideologically coherent. He wasn't just angry, he had a theory. The more he talked, the more another image began to form in the minds of donors and strategists. Not just a senator, but a future running mate, or even standard bearer. The rumors started quietly, in articles and insider newsletters that loved the game of speculation. Lists of potential vice-presidential picks began to circulate. Vance's name appeared next to governors, veteran politicians, media stars. At first it looked like clickbait. Over time, as his profile grew and his ties to the movement deepened, it started to feel like groundwork. Inside the network, the logic was straightforward. A future ticket would need someone who could hold the movement together while extending its reach. Someone who could reassure donors that there was an intellect behind the slogans, and reassure the base that there was still fury behind the intellect. Someone whose life story could be packaged as proof that the project wasn't just about power, but about real America. On paper, he fit the job description almost too well. As the next election cycle approached, he appeared at key rallies and conservative conferences, sharing stages with the same commentators and activists who had amplified his Senate run. He honed a specific public persona: unflinching, slightly disdainful of the press, comfortable taking positions that would have been fringe a decade earlier. He tested lines about the administrative state, civilizational decay, the need for a more assertive government in service of traditional values. Each appearance served three audiences at once: four voters. He was the angry son of the Rust Belt, promising to force Washington to feel what his hometown had suffered. For the movement, he was a sign that their ideas had penetrated the heart of the party, that this was no longer the old conservatism of white papers and polite losses. For the network, he was proof that the investment was maturing. The man they had backed in one state was now a national figure, discussed on panels about the future of the right. Soon, his name wasn't just on VP. Commentators began to talk about him in longer arcs. What happens after the current leader steps aside? Who inherits the base? Who writes the next chapter? The idea of President Vance moved from fringe fantasy to conversation. Peace in think tank halls and donor retreats. None of this meant it was guaranteed. Politics is littered with the ruins of carefully crafted futures that never arrived. Scandals, missteps, changes in public mood, any of these could break the arc. But the larger point was already clear. A boy from a collapsing steel town had become, in less than a decade, one of the most discussed figures in American politics. Not because he stumbled into it, and not because he charmed his way up one handshake at a time. He had been spotted early, developed, financed, and positioned by a network that understood something fundamental about modern power. If you can control the story, and you can fund the storyteller, you can shape the choices a democracy thinks it is making. From the outside, voters saw a senator with a hard voice and a hard life story. Inside the system, people were already gaming out possible election maps with his name on the ticket, whether he ended up in the vice president's residence, the Oval Office, or nowhere near either. One fact would remain: by the time J.D. Vance reached the national stage, he was no longer just a man telling his own story. He was the embodiment of a project that had learned to treat candidates the way Silicon Valley treats startups, as vehicles for a vision of the future. While J.D. Vance was climbing the ladder of formal power, another story was unfolding on a very different stage. It didn't take place in Senate hearing rooms or on the floor of the chamber. It unfolded under bright lights in hotel ballrooms, on college campuses, and across endless streams of vertical video. If Vance's world was built around legislation, this one was built around vibes, conferences, worship music, Instagram reels, and TikTok clips about saving America. This is the world Erika Kirk moves in. Her job isn't to write laws. It's to shape the people who will either accept them, resist them, or never bother to vote in the first place. Where JD speaks the language of policy and decay, Erika speaks the language of calling and purpose. He talks about industrial decline and the need to use state power. She talks about identity, faith, gender, the soul of the nation. Together, whether formally coordinated or not, they cover almost the entire emotional spectrum of the movement they serve. At youth conferences, the pattern is easy to spot if you're looking for it. Young people file into massive some in church clothes, some in merch, phones in hand. On screen, graphics scream about saving America, fighting the enemy within, standing firm. The vibe is part revival, part pep rally, part leadership seminar. Speakers cycle through, influencers, pastors, politicians. It's a carnival of certainty in a culture of doubt. When Erika takes the stage, she doesn't sound like a campaign surrogate. She sounds like a friend from a slightly better future. The message is simple and endlessly repeatable. You are not crazy for feeling like the world has gone off the rails. You are not alone. You were made for this moment. The country is in trouble, but that's why you're here. In that environment, politics stops looking like a distant, corrupt game and starts looking like a personal mission. The organizations she's tied to understand the power of that shift. For years, they've been building a parallel ecosystem of student groups, training programs and conferences designed to catch people before they disappear completely into apathy or the liberal mainstream. They offer community, identity, and a set of enemies that make sense of the chaos. Universities, media, global institutions. The regime, these become the villains in a story where the young activist is suddenly the protagonist. Erika's role is to make that story feel warm rather than cold. Her social feeds are a carefully balanced mix of faith, content, lifestyle, patriotism, and hard-edged talking points. One day she's posting about prayer, marriage, or motherhood. The next she's amplifying speeches about the border, crime, or woke capitalism. The aesthetic is softer than the rhetoric, which is precisely the point. The movement doesn't just need rage. It needs a sense of moral cleanliness, of being on the side of light against encroaching darkness. For the network, this is not a side project. It's the cultural flank. A donor can write a check to a super PAC and buy a week of ads. But if you build a relationship with a 20-year-old who feels seen, heard, and given a mission, you haven't just bought attention. You've bought loyalty, maybe for a decade. In that sense, youth mobilization isn't the campaign. It's the pipeline. This is where the stories of J.D. Vance and Erika Kirk begin to rhyme. He presents himself as living proof that someone from a shattered town can rise high enough to punch back on behalf of people like him. She presents herself as proof that a young woman in a chaotic culture can anchor her life in faith, marriage, and country, and feel powerful, not trapped. For a movement obsessed with decline, they are both sold as counterexamples. Look, it doesn't have to end like this. The system is broken, but we have people who escaped it. When their paths cross on stages or in interviews, the energy is almost scripted even when it isn't. He supplies the diagnosis. A nation hollowed out by bad elites, bad trade deals, and bad wars. She supplies the prescription: recommitment to God, family, and nation, backed by a community that will applaud you when the rest of the world laughs. Strip away the lighting and branding, and what you have is a simple division of labor. J.D. Vance operates at the level of institutions. He sits in rooms where budgets, regulations, and foreign policy are decided. He speaks to committee chairs and cabinet officials, to donors and staffers. His power is formal, codified in votes and titles. Erika operates at the level of imagination. She sits in front of microphones and cameras that reach people who will never read a policy paper or watch C-SPAN. She speaks to the anxious, the uncertain, the young, and the lonely. Her power is informal but no less real. The ability to make millions of people feel that their private frustrations are part of a shared, righteous struggle. For the network that backs this broader project, the synergy is obvious. A senator or vice president who shares your worldview is valuable. A cultural ecosystem that keeps producing voters, volunteers, and online defenders who instinctively trust that senator or vice president is priceless. One can be lost at the ballot box. The other, if built carefully enough, survives, defeats, and waits for the next opportunity. In that sense, the story of Erika Kirk is not a romantic subplot in the saga of J.D. Vance. It's a parallel track of the same campaign. A battle for institutions on one side, a battle for hearts and habits on the other. By the time most people notice how closely those tracks run, they're already traveling on one of them.